here I am within a Jupyter Notebook, and as I mentioned, we already know that I can print out variables. So if I have a list, something like 1, 2, 3, I can simply print that out. What I would have to do is have essentially a print statement for those lines. So let's say I wanted to print 1, 2, 3, and then maybe right below it, I also want to print out 4, 5, 6. And let's say right below that, we'll have one more list, 7, 8, 9. So when I run that all in one cell, I get back this display. Now instead of having to call each of these three print functions over and over again, what I could do is put all of this within my own custom function. So I'll say def, and let's say call this display. And let's imagine that we have 3 rows of information here. So I'll pass in row 1, row 2, and row 3 as arguments or parameters into this function. And then what this function does is it simply prints out row 1 on top of row 2, which is then on top of row 3. So I've defined the function, which means now I can display it. So let's go ahead and make an example row. And my example row for now, we'll just have it be 1, 2, 3. Which means if I pass in example row for each of these rows, row 1, row 2, row 3, let's go ahead and pass it in 2 more times. So I'll say example row, and I'm just using tab here to complete this. Example row. When I run this, notice now, instead of having to call print, print, print 3 times, I simply call display once, and now it's flexible to whatever variables or parameters I have. And then the last thing I want to show you to kind of drive this point home of the flexibility of showing a display to a user is technically this doesn't have to be a list. This could be a string or any other object. So what I want to do is let's go ahead and make 3 unique rows. We'll say row 1 is 1, 2, 3, row 2, and what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to have just some empty strings. And we'll have row 3 equal to, and we'll have another set of empty strings here. And in fact, let's just copy and paste this and make this row 1 as well. So we essentially have just 3 empty strings in 3 lists. So now I'm going to change this from example row to reflect row 1, row 2, and row 3. And something to keep in mind is this can go in another cell. So it doesn't have to be in the same cell. I could, in one cell, define row 1, row 2, row 3, and in the next cell then have this display function. So when I run this, I get back these lists with these empty spaces. And what we can do is later on in our program, let's say we've set up kind of a rudimentary tic-tac-toe board. I could say row 2, go ahead and grab the center position, which if we think about this, the center position here of this 3 by 3 is going to be row 2 at index 1 because we go 0, 1. So that means row 2 at index 1, and let's reassign this to be something like an X. And now what I'm going to do is display those rows again. Row 1, row 2, row 3. I run this, and now I see an X here. And this is a very rudimentary way of just taking in inputs and then displaying something that looks like something a user can visually interpret. This is just a very simple tic-tac-toe board. It's not the nicest looking tic-tac-toe board. You can get even more flexible with using things like strings in order to not actually see these quotes. So instead of having a list here, you would just kind of have this be a long string. And then you can add things like dashes in order to make it look even nicer. But this is just a very rudimentary display. And the next step we want to do is to be able to take in user input in order to have something like this, a reassignment of a particular position in a row or a list, be actually specified by the user themselves. So this is just our overall lecture on displaying information in a simple way that the user can understand. The next thing we want to do is be able to accept user input. So we've already gone over the input function in the useful operators lecture. So if you don't remember it, you might want to do a quick review of that lecture. But coming up next, we're going to expand on this idea of displaying information to accepting user input. Okay, thanks, and I'll see you at the next lecture.